Sarah Whitaker didn't cry when Charles Whitmore pointed his finger at her in the middle of the street and called her a liar in front of the whole town. She had used up every last tear years ago. She just stood there, back straight, jaw tight, hands curled at her sides, while the people of Red Willow stared at her like she was something they needed to scrape off their boots. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke, until one man pushed through the crowd, stepped between her and the noise, and said the three words that changed her life forever. If this story already has your heart beating faster, do me one favor, hit that subscribe button right now, because this journey is only getting started, and you do not want to miss a single moment of what happens next. And before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get into it. She had been standing outside Callahan's general store for no more than 10 minutes when Charles Whitmore decided that was 10 minutes too long. Sarah Whitaker had done nothing wrong. She had been reading the notice board, looking for work, the way any sensible woman in her situation would do. She had a clean dress on, her hair pinned back neat, her old leather suitcase sitting beside her boot like a quiet confession of everything she'd left behind. She wasn't bothering a soul. She wasn't speaking to anyone. She was minding her own business in the way that only a woman who had learned the hard way that minding her own business was the safest thing she could do. But Charles Whitmore didn't need a reason. He never did. He came out of the post office with two men behind him, his coat pressed, his boots polished, his silver watch chain catching the afternoon light, like it wanted everyone in Red Willow to notice it. He was the kind of man who filled every room he walked into and made sure everyone knew exactly how much space he was taking up. He stopped on the boardwalk, looked down at Sarah standing in the dirt, and let a slow, deliberate smile spread across his face. "Well," he said, loud enough for half the street to hear, "look what we got here." Sarah didn't look up right away. She had learned that looking up too fast could be read as aggression. Looking up too slow could be read as guilt. There was a precise, exhausted calculation to how a woman in her position had to carry herself, and she had been performing that calculation for so long it lived somewhere deep in her bones. She folded the paper she'd been reading, set it back on the board. Then she looked up. "Good afternoon," she said. Whitmore stepped down from the boardwalk. His boots hit the dirt with a sound that felt deliberate, like punctuation. He walked toward her the way men like him always walked, slow, certain, already knowing the end of the sentence before it started. "You're the woman who came in on the stage 3 days ago," he said. "It wasn't," Sarah said, "traveling alone." "Yes." He let that sit there between them. He turned halfway to address the people who had begun to slow their pace on the street, the ones who were pretending not to listen while listening to every word. "Now I've made it my business," Whitmore said, his voice carrying like a man who had practiced speaking to crowd to know who comes and goes in this town. "And I've heard some things about you. Miss what is it? Whitaker?" "That's right. I've heard you left your last situation under some questionable circumstances." He said questionable the way a preacher says sin with a kind of savoring quality, like the word itself was doing work he didn't even have to finish. "I've heard you had a disagreement with an employer. Left in a hurry. And before that, there were some questions about your character down in Billings." Sarah felt the familiar cold settle in her chest. Not surprise. Never surprise anymore. It was something older and heavier than surprise. It was the sensation of watching a story get told about you that had your name in it but none of your truth. "I don't believe I've given you my history, Mr. Whitmore," she said, keeping her voice level. "You didn't have to, darlin'. Small towns talk. And I take it upon myself to protect the people of Red Willow from certain, let's call them, situations." "And what situation am I?" she asked. He turned fully to the crowd now. There were a dozen people watching, maybe more. Merchants had come to the edges of their doorways. A woman with a basket on her arm had stopped walking. Two men leaning against the barber pole were watching with the flat, incurious eyes of people who had already decided. "The kind of situation," Whitmore said, "that tends to cause problems wherever she goes." I'd strongly encourage anyone in this town thinking of offering this woman employment or housing to think real hard before they do. There's a reason a woman her age travels alone. There's a reason she keeps moving from town to town. The silence that followed was thick as summer heat. Sarah looked at the faces around her. She looked at the woman with the basket, who dropped her eyes. She looked at the men by the barber pole, who said nothing. She looked at the merchant in the doorway of the hardware store, who turned and went back inside like he'd seen enough. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. And in that silence, in that very familiar and terrible silence, Sarah Whitaker made the decision she had made in every other town, in every other street, in every other moment exactly like this one. She was going to pick up her suitcase, and she was going to walk, and she was not going to let a single one of them see her hands shake. She reached down. Her fingers closed around the handle. "Leave her alone." The voice came from across the street. Not loud, not theatrical. Just plain and flat and absolutely certain, the way a man speaks when he isn't asking permission. Sarah straightened slowly. A man was crossing the street toward them. He was tall, built the way men who worked land were built not for show but for labor, with wide shoulders and calloused hands, and a face that had been weathered into something that wasn't quite hard but wasn't soft either. He wore a plain gray work shirt, no vest, no silver watch chain. His hat was pushed back on his head, like he'd forgotten it was there. He walked the way the land walked, unhurried, even, completely unimpressed by whatever Charles Whitmore thought he was doing. He came to stand 3 feet from Whitmore and looked at him without any particular emotion on his face. "James Caldwell," Whitmore said, and his smile shifted into something slightly more careful. "This doesn't concern you." "Seems to me it's concerning her," James said. "And she's standing on a public street, doing nothing wrong." "So I reckon it's done now." Whitmore's jaw tightened. "I was simply informing the people of this town." "You were running your mouth at a woman standing alone," James said, not raising his voice once. "That's what you were doing. We all saw it." He looked around the street then, a slow, deliberate look that touched every face that had been watching, and something in that look made 2 or 3 people find somewhere else to be. "Now it's done." Whitmore looked at James for a long moment. Then he straightened his coat, settled his hat, and turned back toward the post office, like the whole thing had been his idea to end. "You'll regret making it your business, Caldwell," he said over his shoulder. "Wouldn't be the first time I was wrong," James said. He waited until Whitmore and his men were gone. Then he turned to Sarah. He looked at her the way people rarely looked at her, not with pity, not with judgment, not with that particular mixture of curiosity and discomfort that most people used when they looked at a woman they'd already decided about. He just looked at her like she was a person. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked. Sarah released a breath she had been holding for what felt like the last 3 days. "I'm fine," she said. The words were automatic. They came out before she could decide whether they were true. James Caldwell looked at the suitcase in her hand. He looked at the notice board behind her. "You looking for work?" he asked. She almost said no. She had gotten so good at not asking, at not appearing to need anything, at keeping her face smooth and her wants invisible, that the word no had grown into a kind of reflex. But something about the directness of the question, no preamble, no performance, no trap in it that she could see made her stop. "I am," she said. He nodded like this was just information. Like it didn't need to be anything more than that. "I've got a ranch outside town," he said. "Caldwell Spread, about 3 miles north on the river road. I've been running it short-handed since spring. It's hard work. Early mornings, long days. The pay is fair. There's a room in the house, separate from the main quarters." He paused. "If you're interested, you can come out tomorrow, and we'll talk about what the work looks like." Sarah looked at him. She was very practiced at reading the spaces between what men said and what they meant. She had learned that craft out of necessity, the way all women in hard situations learn it. She didn't find anything in the space between his words. That in itself was so unusual it made her slightly suspicious. "Why?" she asked. He raised an eyebrow. "Why would you offer me work?" she said. "After watching the most powerful man in this town just tell everyone in earshot not to trust me." James Caldwell looked at her with the mild, honest expression of a man who didn't perform things. "Because I don't take Charles Whitmore's word on much of anything," he said. "And because I need good help and you're standing right here." He shrugged one shoulder. "That's about the whole of it, ma'am." She held his gaze for a moment longer. "Sarah Whitaker," she said. He reached out and shook her hand like she was a business partner. "James Caldwell," he said. "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock if you can make it." He touched the brim of his hat, turned and walked back across the street to his ranch supply store, and didn't look back once. Sarah stood in the street for a moment longer. The sun was getting low. The dust had settled back down from Whitmore's departure. The woman with the basket had gone on her way. The street had returned to its ordinary afternoon business, as if none of it had happened. She looked down at the suitcase in her hand. For the first time in longer than she could honestly remember, she didn't feel like she was fighting gravity. She felt very carefully and very quietly, like something might be possible. She picked up the suitcase. She walked toward the boarding house at the end of the street. And she did not let herself think too far ahead, because thinking too far ahead was a luxury she had learned not to afford. But she thought about 8 o'clock. She thought about that. The next morning, Sarah Whitaker arrived at the Caldwell Ranch at 5 minutes to 8 with her suitcase in one hand and a list of her skills written out on a folded piece of paper in the other. She had prepared the list the night before at the small table in her boarding room, writing and rewriting until the word said exactly what she meant and nothing more. James Caldwell was already out in the yard when she came up the road. He was mending a fence post with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who had been doing physical work his whole life and had made a kind of peace with it. He straightened when he saw her, dusted his hands on his trousers, and came to meet her. "You made it," he said. "I said I would," she said. Something moved in his expression quick, almost imperceptible. Like he wasn't used to people who simply did what they said. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you what we're working with." What they were working with was a ranch that had the bones of something solid and the current condition of something that had been slowly running out of hands to hold it together. The house was well built, sturdy, set back from a stand of cottonwoods near the river, but the inside told the story of a man living alone for too long. Dishes stacked in a specific system that was less organization and more surrender. Paperwork piled on the kitchen table in the particular way of a person who had stopped believing he would ever get ahead of it. Supplies kept in ways that made sense to one person and would be invisible to anyone else. The barn was the same, functional, lonely, missing the small efficiencies that came from having more than one mind on a problem. James walked her through everything with the same plain, factual manner he'd used on the street. No apology for the state of things, no excess explanation. Just here is the problem. Here is what I've been managing. Here is what I haven't been managing. Sarah listened. She asked specific questions. She took no notes because she didn't need to. It always that organized itself well, that filed things in order and held them there. When they'd completed the circuit and come back to the yard, he looked at her. "So," he said, "what do you think? I think your supply records are 6 months behind, and your feed rotation is costing you money you don't need to be spending," she said. "I think your house is running on habit instead of system, which means things fall through. And I think you're managing the physical labor well, but the administrative side of this operation is where you're losing ground." James was quiet for a moment. "That's about right," he said. "I can fix all of it," she said. "But I can fix it." She handed him the folded paper. "That's what I know how to do. Cooking, preserving, household management, account keeping, logistics, animal care. I learn fast and I work hard, and I don't complain about things that aren't worth complaining about." He unfolded the paper. "Read it without expression." "I need to be clear about something," Sarah said, because she had learned the hard way that clarity at the beginning was the only thing that prevented disaster at the end. I'm not looking for charity. I'm not looking for pity. I'm looking for fair wages for fair work, a room with a lock on the door, and a plain honest agreement about what's expected of me and what I can expect in return. If that's what you're offering, then we can do business." He folded the paper, looked at her. "The room has a lock," he said. "Wages are $12 a month with meals. You'll manage the household, the records, and whatever else needs doing that your list covers. If you think of something I haven't thought of that would help this place run better, you tell me, and we'll talk about it." "That's fair, it is," he agreed. "One more thing." She waited. "Whatever Whitmore told people about you," James said, "isn't my concern. People around here are going to have opinions. I can't stop that, and neither can you. What I can tell you is that what happens on this property is between the two of us, and as long as you're honest with me, you'll have no trouble from my direction." Sarah held his gaze for a moment. "I've never been dishonest a day in my life," she said. "That's actually been most of my problem." James Caldwell looked at her for a long beat. Then something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but something in the neighborhood of one. "All right then," he said. "You want some coffee before we get started?" "Yes," she said. "I do." She followed him into the house, set her suitcase down by the door, and got to work. The first week was a study in quiet assessment. Sarah moved through the ranch with careful attention, asking questions only when necessary, watching how the rhythms of the place ran and where they broke down. She reorganized the kitchen on the second day, not because she'd been asked to, but because an organized kitchen was the difference between a household that functioned and one that merely survived. She moved the dry goods to a system that made sense chronologically. She identified which supplies were running low, which were being wasted, which were being stored wrong. James noticed. He didn't say anything, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. By the third day, she had started on the account ledgers. They were in worse shape than she'd initially indicated. The record-keeping wasn't just behind, it was inconsistent, with entries that didn't match receipts, costs that had been logged twice or not at all. A running tally of ranch expenses that bore almost no relationship to the actual money that had been spent and received. She sat at the kitchen table with the ledgers stacked in front of her and worked through them with the slow, methodical patience of someone who understood that accuracy was not an optional feature of a business. She worked until the lamp burned low. Then she banked the fire, set the ledgers aside, and went to bed. On the fourth morning, James came in from the early chores to find her already at the table with the ledgers and a pot of coffee ready, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. "You didn't have to start that early," he said. "I wanted to," she said. "There's a discrepancy in your February accounts I want to understand before I move to March." He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. He looked at the ledgers spread out between them. "How bad is it?" he asked. "It's not bad," she said. "It's just confused. Someone was keeping these records who didn't have a strong system." "That was me," he said. "I figured," she said. She turned one of the ledgers toward him. "You've been paying your grain supplier twice on some months. Not every month, but enough that over the course of a year it adds up to." She ran her finger down a column, approximately $47. James set his coffee cup down. $47, he repeated. "I'll need to write to your supplier and reconcile the accounts," she said. "With your permission." He looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, slightly surprised, quickly suppressed, as if he thought surprise was something he ought to keep to himself. "Write the letter," he said. She wrote it that afternoon in her precise, clean hand. She reviewed it twice before sealing it. When she handed it to James to approve, he read it all the way through. "That's exactly right," he said, and his voice had something in it that she identified after a moment as relief. She went into town for the first time on the 6th day, with a list of supplies the ranch needed. She walked to Callahan's General Store, which was the largest merchant in Red Willow, and she was aware the moment she stepped through the door that the woman behind the counter, a Mrs. Callahan, broad and sharp-eyed and thoroughly uninterested in being charmed, recognized her. You're the woman working at Caldwell's, Mrs. Callahan said. Not a greeting. Yes, ma'am, Sarah said. She set the list on the counter. Mrs. Callahan looked at the list without picking it up. Heard you had some trouble on your first day here, she said. I've had trouble in most places I've been, Sarah said. I've generally found it's better to keep working than to stop and explain myself. Mrs. Callahan looked at her then, with an expression that was somewhere between assessment and something harder to name. That's the Caldwell Ranch account, she said, looking at the paper again. It is. James Caldwell pays his bills on time, Mrs. Callahan said. I'll make sure he continues to, Sarah said. Another moment passed. Then Mrs. Callahan picked up the list, read it, set it back down, and started pulling items from the shelves. It wasn't warmth, it wasn't welcome, but it was business, and Sarah understood that business was the beginning of almost everything else. She was loading the supplies into the wagon outside when she felt someone watching her. She didn't turn immediately. She finished what she was doing first. When she did turn, she found a woman about her own age standing on the boardwalk, watching her with an open, curious expression that was distinct from the guarded looks Sarah had been getting everywhere else. You're the one working at James Caldwell's place, the woman said. I am, Sarah said. I'm Lucy Hart, the woman said. My husband has the smithy on the south end of town. She paused. I saw what Whitmore did to you the other day. Sarah waited. Wasn't right, Lucy said simply. What he did. Standing there talking about you like that in front of everyone. No, Sarah said carefully. He does that, Lucy said. To people he wants to push out of the way. My husband, when we first came to Red Willow, Whitmore made things difficult for us, too. Said Tom's rates were too high, tried to get people to go to the smithy in Millbrook instead. We nearly had to leave. We didn't, though. Tom just kept working. Sarah looked at her. What made it stop, she asked. Lucy smiled, and it was a small, tired smile with a long memory behind it. It stopped when Tom fixed Whitmore's prize horse's shoe for free when nobody else was around to do it, she said. Whitmore never thanked him, never acknowledged it in public. But the campaign against us stopped the next week. She shook her head. That's the thing about men like Whitmore. They respect usefulness, even when they resent the person providing it. Sarah thought about that, the whole ride back to the ranch. When she came in with the supplies, James was at the stove, attempting to manage a pot of stew that was losing whatever battle it was engaged in. I've got it, Sarah said, setting the supplies down and coming to look at the pot with the expression of someone conducting a careful damage assessment. I wasn't sure when you'd be back, James said. I can cook in the morning before I go into town, she said. Or I can leave instructions if there are things that need minding. She added a measure of water to the pot. Either way, I'll make sure you're not eating char for dinner. I've eaten worse, he said. I believe you, she said. I've eaten worse too. Doesn't mean we have to. He moved out of her way without being asked, which she appreciated. Some men needed a particular amount of reassurance before they'd let someone else manage a thing they'd been managing badly themselves. James simply got out of the way. Whitmore came by the store while you were there, he asked, sitting at the table. She looked at him. No, why? He has a habit of checking on what I order, James said. Likes to know what's going on around the county. Mrs. Callahan was guarded but professional, Sarah said. I don't think she'll cause trouble. She stirred the stew. I met a woman, Lucy Hart. Her husband has the smithy. Tom Hart, James said. Good man. She was kind, Sarah said. Told me about her own history with Whitmore. James was quiet for a moment. Whitmore has a history with a lot of people in this town, he said. Most of them won't say so out loud. Sarah set the spoon down and looked at him across the kitchen. Is that why he came after me, she asked. Or was there something more specific? James looked at her steadily. My land backs up to the river, he said. That's the most valuable piece of property in this county. Whitmore's been after it for 3 years. Every time I've turned him down, something inconvenient has happened to my operation. He paused. A hired man who quit with no explanation. A supply agreement that fell through. A rumor that my cattle were sick. Sarah's hand stilled on the spoon. He's been systematically making things difficult for you, she said. Yes, and then I arrived, she said. And you hired me. And now there are two of us. That would be Whitmore's reading, James said. Is he wrong? Sarah asked. James looked at her for a long moment. No, he said, he's not wrong. Sarah turned back to the stove. She stirred the stew. The fire crackled. The sound of the wind came through the old walls of the house. Then we'd better make sure the books are in order, she said quietly. All of them. James was quiet for a moment. Then he said very simply, yeah. I reckon we should. Outside the sun was going down over Red Willow. The last light was settling across the riverland, James Caldwell's land, the land Whitmore wanted, the land that Sarah was beginning to understand she had walked into the middle of. She had spent the better part of her adult life walking into the middle of things and finding herself there alone. This time, sitting in the warm kitchen with the stew beginning to smell like something a person might actually want to eat, she noticed that the particular loneliness she carried everywhere with her had, very quietly and without ceremony, set itself down. She wasn't sure yet if it was gone, but it had set itself down. And that, for a woman who had learned to ask very little of the world, felt like something worth holding on to. The stew had barely settled in their bowls before Sarah was already thinking about the ledgers again. That was the thing about a mind like hers, it didn't stop. It catalogued, sorted, cross-referenced, and held on. While James ate across from her in the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but wasn't quite easy either, she was running numbers in her head. February's double payments, the feed rotation losses. The supply agreements that had fallen through with no written explanation. She was building a picture, and the picture was starting to look like something she recognized. It looked like a plan, someone else's plan, laid out slow and careful and patient over years. You said the supply agreement fell through, she said. James looked up from his bowl. Which one? She asked. He set his spoon down, grain and spring before last. I had a standing agreement with a supplier in Billings Dawson Brothers. 3 years running, same terms, no problems. Then one April I got a letter saying they couldn't honor the contract. No explanation, just that they were redirecting their business. Did you follow up? Wrote twice, got nothing back. He picked up his spoon again. Had to scramble to find a replacement and paid nearly double that season. Sarah set her own spoon down. Did you keep those letters? She asked. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who was starting to understand he was being asked something that mattered. Somewhere, he said. Find them, she said. Tonight if you can. And anything else from that period, canceled contracts, unexplained changes, anything that felt wrong at the time. James was quiet for a moment. You think this is bigger than Whitmore just wanting to buy my land, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I think, Sarah said carefully, that a man like Charles Whitmore doesn't leave things to chance. He arranges things, quietly over time, so that by the time anyone notices the pattern, they can't find where it started. She folded her hands on the table. I've seen it before, but I've seen it. James looked at her with something sharp and attentive behind his eyes. Where? He said. She hesitated, not because she was ashamed, but because she was calculating, as she always did, how much truth was safe to offer to a person she was still learning. My family had a farm, she said, in Iowa. My father and my uncle ran it together for 20 years. Then a man from the county land office started coming around. Very friendly at first. Then there were questions about the deed. Then there was a surveyor who drew the boundary lines differently from how they'd always been drawn. Then there were tax notices for land my father had already paid on. She paused. By the time my father understood what was happening, the legal fees had taken more than the land was worth. He lost it, James said. He lost it, Sarah confirmed. The man who arranged it bought it at auction for 1/4 of its value. She met James's eyes. I was 23 years old, and I watched my father sit down at the kitchen table after the last court date and not get up again for 3 days. Something moved in James Caldwell's face, not pity, which she would have hated, but recognition. The look of a person who had sat at their own equivalent of that kitchen table. "That's why you know what to look for," he said. "That's why I know what to look for," she said. He pushed back from the table, stood up, and went to the back room where he kept his papers. She could hear him going through boxes, the quiet sounds of a man who had stored things, without quite being able to throw them away, which she had learned was actually its own form of hope, even in people who didn't know they still had any. He came back 20 minutes later with a wooden box and set it on the table between them. Inside were letters, receipts, a handful of contracts, and 2 notices from the county land office, both dated within the last 3 years. Sarah pulled them toward her. She read slowly. She read the way she had learned to read documents, not just for what they said, but for what they didn't say, for the particular silences of language that concealed things in plain sight. The Dawson brothers' letter was the first thing that stopped her cold. It was politely worded, professional. Said only that they were unable to continue the contract due to a change in regional distribution agreements. Nothing specific, nothing accusatory, signed by a B. Dawson. She turned it over. On the back in pencil, someone had written a name and a date. Not James, the handwriting was different. She set it down carefully. "Who wrote this name on the back?" she asked. James leaned over to look. His expression shifted in a way she couldn't immediately read. "That's my hired man's writing," he said. "Bill Marsh. He handled most of the deliveries that year. Is he still with you?" "He left," James said, "end of that summer. Said he'd found better wages in Helena." Sarah tapped the name on the back of the letter, lightly with one finger. The name that had been written there, in a hand that wasn't James's, was C. Whitmore. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then James Caldwell sat down very slowly, like a man who had just been handed a weight he had been carrying blind and could finally see the shape of. "That son of a don't," Sarah said quietly. "Not yet. We need more than one letter." She set it aside and picked up the county land office notices. "Tell me about these," he told her. Both notices had arrived within 6 months of each other. The first questioned the recorded boundaries of his south pasture, claimed there was a discrepancy in the original survey. The second was a tax reassessment notice that valued the river-adjacent parcel of his land at nearly double its previous assessment, raising his annual tax obligation significantly. "Did you contest them?" she asked. "The first one, yes. I had my original deed pulled and filed a response. It went away after a few months. The second one," he stopped. "I paid it. I didn't have time to fight it, and I didn't want to risk falling behind on the property taxes. If I missed a payment, they'd move to collect," Sarah said. "Yes." She looked at the reassessment notice. The assessor's signature was a name she didn't recognize. But in the corner, in very small print, was a reference number that connected to an authorization from the County Land Commissioner's office. She set that aside too. "I need to write to the county land office," she said. "And I need you to tell me who the land commissioner is." James looked at her. "His name is Gerald Potts," he said. "He's been the commissioner for 6 years. And his relationship with Whitmore?" A pause. "They hunt together every fall," James said. Sarah nodded slowly. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, since the moment on the street when Whitmore had come down off that boardwalk, with his polished boots and his silver watch chain and his performed confidence. She had known the way she always knew things, through the accumulation of small details that other people forgot to notice, through the pattern that emerged when you held enough individual pieces up to the light. But knowing and proving were 2 entirely different things. She squared the papers in front of her and looked at James. "This is going to take time," she said, "and it's going to require careful work. I need you to understand that." "I understand," he said. "Whitmore is going to push harder when he realizes you're not folding," she said. "He's already started, in the street the other day. He'll escalate, I know. And some of it," she said, meeting his eyes directly, is going to land on me. He'll come after me specifically because he knows that undermining me is the easiest way to undermine what we're doing. James looked at her steadily. Let him try, he said. It was said simply, without drama, without performance. Just flat and certain, the same way he'd said leave her alone in the street, and she felt the same thing she'd felt, the particular solidity of a person who meant exactly what they said. She looked down at the papers. All right, she said. Then let's start. They worked at that kitchen table for 2 hours. By the end of it, they had organized everything in the box chronologically, identified the 3 incidents she considered most significant, and drafted a letter to the Billings Land Records Office, requesting copies of any property transactions or legal filings involving the Caldwell Ranch name in the past 5 years. When the lamp started burning low, James stretched his back and looked at the stack of organized papers, with the expression of a man who wasn't used to seeing a problem take into something he could actually address. You do this kind of thing naturally, he said. I do what makes sense, she said. Records don't lie if you know how to read them. He was quiet for a moment. Sarah, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name rather than ma'am, and the shift was small enough that she could have pretended not to notice, except that she noticed everything. She looked up. Thank you, he said, for all of this. She held his gaze for a moment. Don't thank me yet, she said. We haven't done anything that matters yet. But something in her chest had gone warm and quiet in a way she wasn't entirely comfortable with, so she gathered the papers into a neat stack, said goodnight, and went to her room. She lay awake for a while, listening to the house settle, to the sound of the river somewhere beyond the walls. She thought about her father's kitchen table. She thought about the document in the county land office, with Whitmore's name in the corner. She thought about James saying, let him try with the same expression most people reserved for sure things. She thought about the fact that for the first time in a very long time, she was not trying to survive something alone. That thought was more dangerous than anything Charles Whitmore could arrange, and she knew it, and she lay there in the dark with her hands folded on her chest, and let herself feel it anyway. Because she was tired of not letting herself feel things that were true. The trouble came faster than she expected. It always did. She had been at the ranch 12 days when she went into town for the second supply run and found that 3 of the merchants on her list had suddenly developed reasons they couldn't fill the Caldwell account that week. Not permanently, they each said carefully, just not this week. Inventory issues, shipment delays, they were very sorry. They hoped she understood. She understood exactly. She went to Lucy Hart's instead, who was behind the small dry goods counter of her husband's supply shed, and told her what had happened. Lucy's expression did not change. She simply listened. When Sarah finished, Lucy said, "Give me your list." "I don't want to put you and your husband in Whitmore's path," Sarah said. "Tom can handle Whitmore's path," Lucy said. She held out her hand. The list, Sarah. Sarah handed it over. Lucy filled it from her own shelves and charged the Caldwell account at fair rates, and when Sarah tried to say something about the risk, Lucy shook her head. "Whitmore already did his worst to us 3 years ago," she said. "And we're still here. The only thing that changes when you stop being afraid of a man like that is that he loses the one tool that actually works." Sarah looked at her. "You're a good person, Lucy," she said. "I'm a practical person," Lucy said. "Good and practical tend to look similar when you're the one being squeezed." She tied the last bundle closed. "You tell James Caldwell that Tom says hello, and you tell him to come into town for a drink when he has a moment. He's been hiding out on that riverland long enough." Sarah smiled. It came naturally, which still surprised her sometimes that she still had natural smiles in her, that they hadn't all been used up. She drove the wagon back along the river road with Lucy's supplies, and with the information sitting in her mind like a stone dropped into water, sending out rings. Whitmore had moved. He had gone to the merchants. That meant one of 2 things. Either he was simply tightening the pressure on James the way he always did, or something had changed. Something had made him accelerate. She was still working through which one when she came over the rise and found a man she didn't recognize standing in the yard of the Caldwell Ranch. He was talking to James. Or rather, he was talking at James, the kind of talking that didn't pause to wait for a response, that filled all the available space with words on purpose so that the other person couldn't find an opening. He was well dressed for the county, not as polished as Whitmore, but carrying the particular smooth confidence of someone who worked adjacent to power and knew it. Sarah brought the wagon to a stop and got down. The man glanced at her. His expression shifted a quick recalibration, the kind a person makes when they've been expecting an empty stage and found it occupied. "This your housekeeper?" he said to James. "This is Sarah Whitaker," James said evenly. "She manages my accounts." Something flickered across the man's face. "I'm Gerald Potts," he said to Sarah, "County Land Commissioner." "I know who you are," Sarah said pleasantly. "I've been reading your correspondence." A pause, brief, small, but she caught it. "I was just informing Miss Caldwell," Potts said, turning back to James, "that the county has received a petition regarding the disputed survey of his south pasture boundary. Given the complexity of the matter, we'll need to schedule a formal review, which will require access to the property." "When was this petition filed?" Sarah asked. Potts looked at her again, the look of a man deciding how seriously he needed to take a question. "Recently," he said. "By whom?" "Petitions are filed by interested parties in the county. The specific filer is a matter of administrative record." "Then I'd like to file a request for that administrative record," Sarah said. "Today, if possible. I can send the written request with James this afternoon, if you'll tell me the correct office to address it to." Gerald Potts looked at her for a moment, with the careful expression of a man rearranging something in his mind. "Of course," he said. His voice had shifted slightly, not hostile, not quite, but flattened in a particular way. "The county clerk's office accepts those requests." "Wonderful," Sarah said. "We'll have it sent today." He stayed another 10 minutes, continuing to speak to James about the review process in the smooth, uninformative way of a bureaucrat who had mastered the art of saying many words that contained very little actual information. Sarah listened to every word. She catalogued the gaps. When he left, James watched the man disappear down the road and then turned to Sarah. "That's the first time Potts has ever come out here in person," said Ed. "I know," she said. "That means something changed." "Yes," she said. She was already thinking about the letter they had sent to Billings. Whether it had arrived, whether someone had noticed it, whether Whitmore had connections at the Land Records Office, who might have mentioned it. In a well-arranged system, information traveled in all directions. "Unload the wagon," she said quietly. "I need to write some letters." "How many?" James asked. "At least 4, she said. "Possibly 5. She wrote them at the kitchen table while James handled the afternoon chores. She wrote to the Billings Land Records Office, following up on the previous inquiry. She wrote to the county clerk's office, requesting the petition documents Potts had referenced. She wrote to the State Land Board in Helena, requesting a list of all formal property disputes involving the river corridor in the past 5 years. And she wrote to a lawyer in Billings, whose name she had gotten from Lucy Hart, a man named Robert Vale, who had apparently handled a land case 2 counties over with some success. The 5th letter she hesitated over for a long time. Then she wrote it anyway to the Dawson Brothers Grain Company in Billings, addressed directly to the original signatory on the letter in the box. She asked, very politely and very specifically, whether they would be willing to speak confidentially about the circumstance of termination of their contract with the Caldwell Ranch, and whether that termination had been influenced by any third party. She sealed them all before she could second-guess herself. When James came in for supper, she handed him the stack. He looked at them, counted them. 5, he said. 5, she confirmed. He looked at her. "You think this is going to work?" he asked. "Not hopeless." James Caldwell did not do hopeless. She was learning. "Just honest. Just asking. I think," she said, turning to the stove, That Charles Whitmore has been operating under the assumption that the people he targets don't know what questions to ask or who to him to. She stirred the pot. That assumption is no longer accurate. James was quiet for a moment. What made you this way, he asked. She didn't answer immediately. She found the bowls, set them on the table, ladled the stew. Loss, she said finally. The right kind of loss teaches you what to pay attention to. She sat down. The wrong kind just breaks you. He sat down across from her. Which kind did you have, he asked. She looked at him. Both, she said. He nodded slowly, like a man who understood that answer from the inside. They ate in the quiet that had become its own kind of language between them, not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people who were saying things in other ways. Through the passing of the bread, through the second cup of coffee poured without asking, through the way James, when he got up to bank the fire, moved carefully around the space where she was working, so as not to interrupt her. She noticed all of it. She cataloged it, the way she cataloged everything. She filed it under a category she hadn't used in a very long time, and she was careful, very careful, not to examine the contents of that category too closely. Not yet. The next morning she was in the barn doing the morning feeding when she heard a horse come fast up the road. She came out to find Lucy Hart dismounting from her mare, with an expression that Sarah had not seen on her before, not panic, but the controlled urgency of a person who has received bad news and is managing it carefully. What happened? Sarah said. Whitmore was at Callahan's this morning, Lucy said. He was talking to 3 merchants, and the man who runs the telegraph office. She caught her breath. He was asking about letters, specifically about letters sent from the Caldwell Ranch to Billings. He knows you've been making inquiries. Sarah felt something cold move through her. How did he know? There's only one telegraph office, Lucy said. One postwriter. And Whitmore has been buying goodwill in this county for a long time. Sarah was already moving toward the house. Where's James? She said. He rode out to the south pasture an hour ago, said a voice behind her. She turned. Billy, the young ranch hand James employed 2 days a week, was standing in the barn doorway. Can you ride out and bring him back? She said. Billy looked at her face and didn't ask questions. He went to the stable. Sarah went to the kitchen table. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the surface and she thought. If Whitmore knew about the letters or suspected, which was the same thing in practice, then he would move before any responses came back. That was what she would do in his position. Strike before the documentation was assembled. Attack the credibility of the source before the source could produce anything concrete. The source was her. That was the only logical target. Not James. James had deep roots here, a reputation, relationships. But Sarah was new. Sarah was already marked. Sarah was the one Whitmore had publicly characterized as untrustworthy before she'd even unpacked her suitcase. She was thinking about what form the attack would take when James came through the door 15 minutes later, hat in hand, reading her face. Tell me, he said. She told him. He was quiet for a moment when she finished. The kind of quiet that isn't absence but accumulation. He's going to come after you directly, James said. Yes. Sarah looked at him. We stay ahead of him, she said. We make sure that everything I've touched, every record, every letter, every account entry is documented and witnessed before he has a chance to challenge it. She leaned forward. Is there anyone in this town, a lawyer, a justice of the peace, someone with official standing who isn't in Whitmore's pocket? James thought. Judge Harlan Bates, he said slowly. He's the circuit judge. Comes through every 2 months. He's due in Red Willow next week. Is he honest? Sarah asked. Honest enough that Whitmore threw a dinner for him twice, and neither time got what he wanted, James said. Sarah nodded. Then I need to get everything organized before he arrives, she said. Every document, every record, every letter sent and received. We're going to put it in front of Judge Bates and ask him to notarize the chain of evidence before Whitmore can muddy it. James looked at her with something in his face she had seen before but hadn't yet named. That's not a small thing, he said. Putting yourself in front of a judge in this county. making yourself visible like that. No, she agreed. It's not small. He'll know exactly what we're doing, James said. Whitmore will. And he'll accelerate, Sarah said. Yes, which is why we need to be faster. James held her gaze. Are you sure, he said. She thought about her father's kitchen table. She thought about every town where she had quietly folded herself up and moved on, rather than stand still and be a target. She thought about Whitmore's boots in the dirt, and the crowd that had watched and said nothing. She thought about James saying, let him try. I'm sure, she said. The week before the judge arrived was the hardest work Sarah had done in years, and she had done very hard work for most of her life. She organized everything. She cross-referenced the account ledgers against every receipt she could find. She wrote a formal summary of the financial irregularities she had identified, sourced to specific documents and dates, and had James read it twice and confirm every fact. Lucy Hart came out to the ranch twice to help. Tom Hart came once, looked at the pile of documents spread across the kitchen table, and said quietly to James, you picked the right person. James didn't answer, but the way he didn't answer was itself a kind of answer. The night before Judge Bates was due to arrive in Red Willow, Sarah sat at the table with the last of the paperwork and felt the exhaustion settle into her bones like cold water. Not the kind of exhaustion that defeats you. The kind that comes after you have done everything you could think to do and now have to wait to see if it was enough. James came in late from the evening chores and found her still at the table. He didn't say anything for a moment. He got 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her. Then he sat down. You know, he said, when I walked across that street 2 weeks ago, I thought I was doing something simple. She wrapped her hands around the cup. Was it? She said. He considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. No, he said, but I don't regret it. She looked at him. Why did you do it? She asked. The real reason. Not just because you needed help with the ranch. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Because I know what it looks like, he said finally. When a person is out there by themselves in front of a crowd and there isn't a single face looking back at them that means anything good. He looked at the coffee in his hands. I know what that looks like from the inside, and I decided a long time ago that if I ever had the chance to make it stop for someone else, I would. Sarah held that thought carefully, the way you hold something fragile. Who was it for you? She asked quietly. He looked up. My wife, he said. After she got sick. The way some people we thought were friends just stepped back. Decided it wasn't their trouble. He paused. I stood there in front of all of them and I couldn't do a thing about it. She deserved better than that. The kitchen was very quiet. I'm sorry, Sarah said, and she meant it the way people rarely mean it, without any of the social scaffolding around it. Just the plain truth of it. So am I, he said. He looked up then, and there was something in his eyes clear and direct and unhidden in the way that tired people sometimes stopped hiding things at the end of a long day. But I'm less sorry about some things than I was 2 weeks ago. Sarah looked at her coffee. Don't, she said softly. Don't what? Don't say something that means more than either of us is ready to talk about yet, she said. We've got a judge coming tomorrow and Whitmore circling and 5 letters out to people who may or may not write back. Let's get through the next week first. A pause. That's reasonable, James said. Thank you, Sarah. She looked up. We're going to get through the next week, he said. Flat and certain. The same way he said everything that mattered. She held his gaze for one moment. Then she looked back at the papers. Yes, she said. We are. Outside, the river moved on in the dark, patient and unhurried, the way things move when they know where they're going and have all the time in the world to get there. And inside the warm kitchen of the Caldwell Ranch, 2 people who had both learned the particular education of being alone sat across a table full of evidence and got ready to fight. Judge Harlan Bates arrived in Red Willow on a Tuesday, the way he always did, quiet, unannounced to most, riding in on a brown mare with no escort and no ceremony. He was a compact man in his 60s, with a face that had done a great deal of listening over a long career, and had arrived at a particular economy of expression that made him difficult to read and very easy to underestimate. That was, Sarah suspected, exactly how he preferred it. She had 1 hour with him before his official schedule began. James had arranged it through a note sent the previous evening to the boarding house, where Bates always stayed. The note had been plain rancher, requesting a brief consultation on a property matter before the formal court session. The kind of request a circuit judge received dozens of times in every county. Nothing about it that should attract attention. Sarah carried the documents in a leather satchel she had borrowed from James. She had organized everything in the order a person would need to read it if they were encountering it for the first time chronologically, with a one-page summary at the front that laid out the key points without embellishment or editorial comment. Just dates, names, amounts. James walked beside her into town. He had offered to let her go alone if she thought his presence would complicate things. She had told him plainly that his presence was the one thing that made the meeting legitimate, so he was coming, and that was final. He had not argued. Judge Bates was at a corner table in the boarding house dining room when they arrived, eating breakfast with the methodical focus of a man who understood the value of food before a long day. He looked up when they came in, assessed them both in the way judges assess things without the assessment being visible until after it was complete, and gestured at the chairs across from him. "Sit," he said. They sat. "Caldwell," he said. "You've had property at the river for what, 12 years now?" 14, James said. He looked at Sarah. "And you are?" "Sarah Whitaker," she said. "I manage Mr. Caldwell's accounts." "Since when?" 3 weeks, she said. Something moved in Bates's eyes, quick, intelligent, gone before it fully arrived. 3 weeks, he repeated. "Yes, sir," she said. She opened the satchel and set the summary page in front of him. "I understand your time is limited, so I've prepared a summary. The supporting documentation is here in full." He picked up the summary. He read it without expression. It took him 4 minutes, which told her he was reading carefully and not skimming. When he set it down, he looked at James. "You know what you're putting in motion," he said. It was not a question. "I do," James said. "Charles Whitmore has significant standing in this county." "I know that too." Bates looked back at the summary. Then at Sarah. "These supply contract discrepancies," he said. "You identified them from the existing ledgers?" "Yes, sir." "The double payments were recorded in the ledger, and I cross-referenced them against the original receipts. The receipts are in the satchel, marked with red paper tabs." He held out his hand. She placed the relevant section of documents in it. He went through them with the steady, unhurried attention of someone who was not performing thoroughness, but actually practicing it. She waited. "The letter with the name written on the back," he said, without looking up. "Tab marked with 2 red marks," she said. He found it. "Read it." Turned it over. Looked at the penciled name. Set it down. "Where is Bill Marsh now?" he asked. "We don't know," James said. "He left the ranch at the end of summer, 2 years ago. Said he'd found work in Helena." Bates was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to tell you this is simple," he said finally. "Because it isn't. A penciled name on the back of a letter is suggestive, not conclusive. The double payments are documented, but they could be attributed to bookkeeping error. The tax reassessment was within the commissioner's authority." He set the pages down and looked at James directly. "What you have is a pattern. Patterns require corroboration. We have letters out to Billings," Sarah said, "to the Land Records Office, and directly to the Dawson Brothers Supply Company." Bates looked at her. "You contacted Dawson Brothers?" "Yes, sir. And you expect them to cooperate?" "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that a business which was pressured by a third party into breaking a 3-year contract with a good customer may have its own reasons to want that pressure documented." Bates was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, "What do you want from me today, Miss Whitaker?" "I want the documents notarized," she said. "I want an official record that this evidence existed, in this form, before anyone had the opportunity to dispute or alter it. And I want your honest assessment of whether what we have is worth pursuing." The judge looked at her for a long moment. "You've done this kind of work before," he said. "No, sir," she said. "I've needed someone else to do it before, and nobody did. So I learned how." Something shifted in Harlan Bates's face, not quite a smile, but something that recognized something. "Leave the documents," he said. "Come back at 2 o'clock. I'll have them notarized, and I'll have reviewed everything. At 2 o'clock I'll tell you what I think." Sarah stood. James stood. "Thank you, Judge," James said. Bates had already picked up his fork again. "Don't thank me yet," he said, with the dry practicality of a man who had heard a great deal of premature gratitude over the years. "Come back at 2. They walked out into the morning street, and Sarah let herself exhale properly for the first time since waking up. "That went well," James said. "We won't know until 2 o'clock," she said. "It went well," he repeated, and there was a quiet certainty in his voice that she had stopped arguing with, because she was beginning to understand that James Caldwell's certainty was not the reckless kind, but the kind built from a long, accurate history of reading situations correctly and keeping his mouth shut about everything else. They split up for the morning, James to the ranch supply store, to place orders with the one merchant who had stayed open to the Caldwell account, Sarah to Lucy Hart's to drop off a sealed letter and collect her thoughts. Lucy had coffee ready, which Sarah suspected was not coincidence. "How did it go?" "He listened," Sarah said. "That's more than I expected. Bates is a fair man," Lucy said. "He's not brave, he won't go out in front of a thing before it's ready to be gone in front of. But he's fair. If you bring him something solid, he'll do something with it." "We need Dawson Brothers to respond," Sarah said. "Everything else is circumstantial." Lucy poured the coffee, set the cup down, looked at Sarah with the expression of a woman who was about to say something she had been holding for a while. "Tom talked to someone last night," she said. "A man named Ellis, who drove freight through the county 2 years ago. He's in Red Willow for the week, staying at the livery." Sarah went very still. "What kind of talking?" she said. "The kind where Ellis says he was carrying a message from Whitmore to Billings that spring," Lucy said quietly. "He didn't know what was in it. But he knew who sent it and who it was going to, because Whitmore paid him double the normal rate and told him to say nothing about the delivery." "Would he say so officially?" Sarah asked. Lucy hesitated. "He's scared," she said, "but Tom thinks with the right conversation." Sarah was already standing. "Where is he?" she said. "The man named Ellis was at the livery on the south of town, mending tack with the look of a person who was trying very hard to appear invisible. He was about 50, weathered, with hands that had seen a lot of outdoor work and eyes that looked sideways before they looked forward, the particular habit of a man who had learned that the wrong piece of information in the wrong place could cost him more than he earned." Sarah sat down on the bench across from him without asking permission. She didn't preamble. "I know you carried a message for Charles Whitmore to Billings 2 springs ago," she said. "I'm not asking you to prove it. I'm asking you to tell me what you saw and heard and what you were paid." Ellis looked at her. Then he looked around the livery. "I don't want trouble," he said. "I know," she said. "Trouble has a way of finding people, whether they want it or not. The question is whether you want to be standing in front of it or behind the people who've already decided to face it." Ellis turned the leather strap over in his hands. "I carried a sealed envelope," he said. "Whitmore's seal on it. Addressed to a Gerald Potts, care of the County Land Commission in Billings." "Potts was in Billings at that point?" Sarah asked. "Different office, same man," Ellis said. "He was deputy commissioner then. Moved up since." Sarah absorbed that. "What were you told?" she said. "Told to deliver it personally, not through the post. Told to wait for a response and carry it back. Told not to discuss the delivery." He paused. "Paid $5, which is more than a week's freight work." "Did you wait for the response?" "I did, and you carried it back." "I did. To Whitmore directly to his office," Ellis said. "He wasn't there. His man took it." Sarah was careful about the next question. "Would you be willing to write down what you've just told me and sign it?" she said. "Not for court, not yet. Just for the record. A written statement witnessed by 2 people. Ellis looked at his hands. Whitmore'll know, he said. He'll suspect, Sarah said. There's a difference. And by the time he's certain, we'll have enough from Billings that your statement is one piece of a larger set of documents. She looked at him directly. You won't be standing alone. He was quiet for a long moment. Who's the rancher involved, he asked. James Caldwell, she said. Something moved in Ellis's face. Caldwell gave me work once, he said. When I was between routes. Never asked anything in return for it. That sounds like him, Sarah said. Ellis set the leather strap down. Get me a paper and a pen, he said. She was back at the boarding house at 2 o'clock, with Ellis's signed statement folded inside the satchel alongside everything else. James was already there, waiting outside the door of the room Bates was using as a temporary office. He looked at her face when she came up the steps. You found something, he said. We found something, she said, and told him in 3 short sentences. He closed his eyes for a moment. Just a brief moment. Tom Hart, he said quietly, and Lucy, Sarah said. He opened his eyes and looked at her, with the full weight of what she had done in 4 hours, settled in his expression. Sarah, 2 o'clock, she said. She nodded at the door. He almost smiled. Then he knocked. Judge Bates had spent the 2 hours well. The documents were organized in a different order than Sarah had arranged them, his order, which told her he had built his own understanding of the sequence rather than accepting hers. The notary seal was on 7 of the pages. He had added a handwritten summary of his own on official paper, which he set aside when they came in. Sit, he said. They sat. What you have, Bates said, without preamble, is sufficient to open a formal inquiry. Not a trial. Not a verdict. An inquiry, which means an official investigation into the conduct of the County Land Commissioner's office with respect to the Caldwell property. He looked at James. What that means practically is that Whitmore's ability to move against your land becomes legally constrained while the inquiry is open. Nobody can process a property transfer or a tax delinquency claim on the parcel under question while it's under formal review. James let out a slow breath. How long does an inquiry take? Sarah asked. Could be 3 months, could be longer. Bates looked at her. You said you have letters out to Billings. Yes, sir. If Dotson Brothers corroborates the pressure on the contract, that changes things considerably, he said. That would be enough for me to refer to the State Land Board. He paused. Which is significantly above Charles Whitmore's sphere of influence. Sarah held very still, but Bates said, and the word landed the way that particular word always landed, with all its weight. There it is, James said quietly. If you proceed with a formal inquiry, Bates said, Whitmore will respond. He will not accept this quietly. He will come after you specifically, Miss Whitaker, with everything he has on your history in this county and in other counties. He will attempt to discredit the source of this documentation before the documentation itself can be examined. I know, Sarah said. I need you to understand what that means, Bates said. I've seen men like him operate. They don't just dispute evidence. They destroy the person who presented it. Your reputation, your employment situation, your history before arriving here, all of it becomes a weapon. I know, Sarah said again. And you want to proceed? She didn't hesitate. Yes, she said. Bates looked at her for a long moment with the kind of look that a person gives when they are deciding how much of what they're thinking to say out loud. You're either very brave or very certain, he said. Both, she said. And I've added this. She placed Ellis's statement on the table. Bates picked it up. Read it. His expression did not change. He set it down. Where is this man now? He said. He's in Red Willow through the end of the week, Sarah said. He's willing to appear before you directly if you require it. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a situation tipping. Bates picked up his pen. Bring him in this afternoon, he said. 3 o'clock. He signed the formal inquiry notice with the clean, decisive motion of a man who had made his decision and was comfortable with it. They walked out of that room with a notarized document, a signed inquiry notice, and a 3 o'clock appointment. They made it half a block down the main street before James stopped. Sarah stopped too. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the same expression she had seen that night at the kitchen table, when she'd told him about her father's farm, except now it had something else in it. Something fuller. Something that had more history behind it than 2 weeks could account for, the way some feelings arrive ahead of schedule. "Say it," she said quietly. "I don't know how to say it correctly," he said. "Try." He looked at her for a long moment. "When I walked across that street 3 weeks ago," he said, "I thought I knew what I was doing. I was stopping something wrong from happening to someone who deserved better." He paused. "I had no idea who you were, and now," she said. "Now I know who you are," he said. "And I don't know what to do with the fact that—" He stopped. He looked away, then back. "That the best person I have ever met is standing on this street, and the whole town is about to come for her, because she did the right thing." The words landed somewhere in Sarah's chest with a quiet, devastating accuracy. She looked at him. "The whole town has come for me before," she said. "I know. And I'm still standing, I know that too." He looked at her with something plain and unguarded in his expression. "That's exactly what I mean." She did not let herself say what was true right then, because the street was not the place, and the moment was not the moment, and they both had a great deal yet to survive before that conversation was one she could afford to have. 3 o'clock, she said. 3 o'clock, he agreed. They walked back the way they'd come, and if their pace was slightly slower than it needed to be, and if the distance between them felt more particular than it had an hour ago, neither of them said so. Whitmore found out by sundown. Sarah had been expecting it. She had not been expecting him to come to the ranch himself. But that was exactly what he did. She heard the horses, first 2 of them, moving fast on the river road. She came to the front of the house and saw Whitmore and one of his men coming up the approach with particular urgency of a person who has just received news that interrupted something important and hasn't had time to reassemble his performance. She did not go inside. She stood at the top of the porch steps and waited. James came around the side of the house from the barn, reading her stance, reading the sound. He moved to stand beside her without saying a word. Whitmore pulled his horse up hard in the yard and dismounted before it had quite stopped. His face was doing things his face did not usually do in public, things that lived underneath the polished exterior, things that became visible when a man was angry enough to forget to hide them. "You filed an inquiry notice with Judge Bates," he said. Not an accusation, a statement, like he was confirming something he couldn't quite believe. "We did," James said. Whitmore looked at Sarah. "You." Just the one word. But the way he said it carried the weight of everything he had been building against her since the moment she stepped off the stage in Red Willow. The contempt, the calculation, the particular fury of a man who had underestimated something, and was only now understanding the full cost of that error. "Mr. Whitmore," Sarah said, and her voice was calm and clear in the way that only comes from having been afraid for a long time, and coming out the other side of it. "You've spent 3 weeks trying to make me leave this town. You've spoken against me in the street, turned merchants away from the Caldwell account, and sent the county commissioner to this property in an attempt to intimidate Mr. Caldwell into a legal situation he couldn't navigate." She held his gaze without blinking. "You did all of that because you assumed I didn't know what you were doing." Whitmore said nothing. The silence itself was a kind of answer. "I know exactly what you've been doing," she said. "And now Judge Bates knows too. And there's a formal inquiry open that legally constrains any action against this property while it's under review." She paused. "I suggest you speak with your lawyer." Whitmore looked at James. "Call her off," he said. "Whatever she's told you, whatever she's found, it doesn't have to go where she's taking it. I'm prepared to offer you fair market value for the river parcel, cash, immediate settlement, no dispute about the rest of your land." James looked at him for a moment. "No," he said. "You should think about what you're—" "I've thought about it," James said. "No." Whitmore's expression changed in a way Sarah had not seen before. Something cold and calculated replaced the anger, and she recognized it as the version of him that was actually dangerous, not the performance, but the thing underneath the performance. She won't be here long enough for it to matter, he said quietly. Women like her don't stay, they never do. The words were aimed precisely. Sarah felt them land. She did not flinch. Women like me, she said, have been told to leave every place they've ever been. She met his eyes. I'm still here. Whitmore looked at her for a moment longer. Then he turned and mounted his horse, with the controlled precision of a man who was deciding something. This isn't finished, he said. I know, Sarah said. He rode out with his man behind him, fast down the river road, and the sound of hooves faded into the evening. James stood beside her until the sound was gone. He's going to come back with something worse, he said. Yes, she said. Are you ready? She looked out at the road where Whitmore had been. She thought about the notarized documents in the satchel inside. She thought about Ellis's signed statement and Judge Bates's pen moving on official paper. She thought about Lucy Hart filling supply orders without being asked, and Tom Hart telling a frightened freighter that honesty was worth the cost. She thought about James Caldwell crossing a street because he could not stand to see one more person stand alone in front of something they didn't deserve. She thought about her father's kitchen table, and about herself at 23, learning everything she had needed to learn about what happened when you didn't fight back. She had spent a decade becoming the person who could fight back. She had not known what she was building herself into or why, only that it needed to be done. It was as if some part of her had understood, long before the rest of her caught up, that the right moment would come. It had come, right here, right now, in a River Road ranch in Montana with a man who had crossed a street for her, and a town that had written her off, and a county commissioner who had spent years thinking no one was paying attention. Yes, she said. James looked at her. Then he did something he had not done before. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with any performance attached to it. Just took her hand the way a person takes hold of something they intend to keep. She looked down at their hands, then up at him. I told you we weren't ready to talk about this yet, she said. I know, he said. I reckon I'm not real good at waiting when I know what I mean. She looked at him for a long moment. She did not pull her hand away. Dawson Brothers still needs to write back, she said. I know, he said. And the State Land Board. I know, he said again with the patient certainty of a man who understood that she needed to say these things and was willing to hold her hand while she said them. She looked out at the evening, at the land, at the river she could hear but not see. This is a very inconvenient time, she said very quietly. Yes, he agreed, it is. She did not say anything else. Neither did he. They stood together on the porch of the ranch that Whitmore wanted, and that James had built, and that Sarah had spent 3 weeks quietly saving, while the day finished turning into night around them. And somewhere in Billings, in an office Sarah had written to with careful, precise language and exactly the right questions, a man named B. Dawson was reading a letter and deciding what the truth was worth. The letter from Billings arrived on a Thursday. Sarah knew it before she opened it. There was something about the weight of the envelope, the way it sat in her hand with a density that plain correspondence never quite achieved. She had been waiting 11 days. 11 days of waking up before dawn and working through the account books and going into town for supplies and watching the road the way people watch something they are trying not to want too badly. She opened it at the kitchen table while James stood in the doorway with his coffee and said nothing. Because he had learned that Sarah opening important correspondence needed the same quiet that a surgeon needed at work, not because she was fragile, but because she was precise, and precision required silence. She read it through once. Then she set it flat on the table and read it again. Then she looked up. B. Dawson's full name is Benjamin Dawson, she said. He took over the company from his father 6 years ago. He is 29 years old. He has a wife and 2 children, and he has been carrying the knowledge of what he did for 2 years. James set his coffee cup down on the counter. He confirmed it, James said. He confirmed it, Sarah said. Enright signed. With a notary seal from Billings. She looked at the letter again. He received a letter from Gerald Potts on County Commissioner Stationery, informing him that the county was reviewing grain supply agreements in the region and that suppliers found to be in contract with certain ranchers under dispute might find their business licenses complicated. She paused. It wasn't a direct threat. It was the kind of communication that a lawyer could pick apart in 3 different directions. But Dawson understood it. He says he understood it the same day it arrived. James crossed to the table and stood beside her. He read the letter over her shoulder. She heard his breathing change. He kept the original Potts letter, James said quietly. He kept it, Sarah said. He has been keeping it in a locked drawer for 2 years because, and I want you to hear exactly what he writes here. She found the line. I did not know when the time would come to use it, but I understood that a man who would write such a letter to a legitimate supplier would eventually write similar letters to other people, and that when enough of those people were found, the record would matter. She set the page down. He is sending the original to Judge Bates by special courier. It should arrive within the week. The silence in the kitchen was the specific silence of something that had been building for a very long time finally arriving at its shape. That's enough, James said. He said it quietly, almost to himself. That's enough for Bates to take it to the state board. It's enough for more than that, Sarah said. Potts used official county stationery to intimidate a private business. That's not just improper conduct, that's abuse of public office. She looked at James. That's a criminal matter. James pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily with the look of a man who had been braced for a long fight and had just been told the terrain had shifted. How long have you known it would get here? He said. I thought it might, she said. I hoped. But knowing and hoping are different things, he said. You've said that before. It's true every time I say it. He looked at the letter. What do we do now? He said. We write to Judge Bates today, Sarah said. We tell him the letter from Dawson is coming, and we ask for an emergency session before his circuit moves on. We have the inquiry notice, Ellis's statement, the original ledger documents, and now a signed corroboration from Billings, with an original piece of evidence that connects Potts directly to Whitmore's campaign. She folded her hands on the table. We put it all in front of Bates at once, and we let the record speak. James looked at her steadily. And Whitmore, he said. Whitmore will find out, she said. He probably already suspects something is moving, the way men like him always sense when the ground shifts under them. He'll make a move before Bates can convene. She met James's eyes. That's the part I'm not sure about. What kind of move? The kind that comes at me, she said, not at the documents. Documents are hard to attack once they're notarized. But the person who assembled them, she stopped. Still attackable, James finished. Yes. He stood up. He went to the window and stood there for a moment, with his back to her, and she watched the set of his shoulders, the particular tension of a man working through something he had decided before he finished thinking it through. He turned around. I'm not going to let him come after you, he said. James, I'm not talking about fighting him in the street, he said. I'm talking about making it very clear to everyone in this town before he makes his move that you are not standing out here alone. He looked at her directly. I want to make a public statement to the town before Bates's session that you have my full confidence, my full support, and that anyone who repeats Whitmore's accusations about your character is going to hear from me directly. Sarah looked at him. That will make you a larger target, she said. I'm already the largest target, he said. He wants my land. That hasn't changed. All that changes is that I stop pretending this is just a property dispute, and I say out loud that it's also about a woman who was falsely accused in a town that let it happen. The words hit her somewhere she wasn't prepared for. You don't have to do that, she said. I know I don't have to, he said. That's why it means something. She held his gaze for a long moment. There was a battle going on somewhere inside her chest, between the part of her that had spent years learning not to need anything from anyone, and the part of her that had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this. Write your letter to Bates, he said. I'll go into town. She started to speak. Sarah, he said. And the way he said her name had become its own language over the past weeks, plain and steady, and carrying more weight than the syllables could technically account for. Let me. She looked at the letter from Billings. Then she looked at him. Be careful what you say, she said. Nothing that sounds like an accusation until we're in front of Bates. Just your confidence in me. That's enough. That's what I was planning, he said. He took his hat and went into town. She sat down and wrote the letter to Judge Bates, which took her 40 minutes and 4 drafts, because she needed every word to be exactly right. And she was still checking the final version when Billy came in from the barn and told her that Lucy Hart was riding up the road. Lucy arrived with the compressed urgency of someone who had been riding faster than was comfortable and didn't apologize for it. Whitmore called a meeting, she said, the moment Sarah opened the door. This morning. At Callahan's, he's telling people you forged documents. He's saying you've done it before in other counties. He has a man with him, a man nobody in Red Willow has ever seen, who is claiming he knows you. She caught her breath. From a property dispute in Wyoming 3 years ago, where you allegedly altered records to benefit your employer. Sarah went very still. Who is this man, she said. Nobody knows his name. He came in on last night's stage. Sarah sat down in the nearest chair. She sat down not because her legs were giving out, but because she needed to think, and she thought better when she was still. Wyoming. 3 years ago, she turned the timeline over in her mind. 3 years ago, she had been in Cheyenne, working as a bookkeeper for a livestock operation. She had left that position because the owner had asked her to make entries that weren't accurate, and she had refused. She had left quietly, without a dispute, without any legal proceeding of any kind. She had left because she had learned by then that quiet exits were safer than the alternative. She had left nothing behind that could be used, unless someone had been building something for her. Unless someone had anticipated at some point that she might end up somewhere doing something like exactly this. The cold that moved through her then was deeper than anything Whitmore had produced before. Because this was not improvised. This was prepared. He knew I was going to be a problem, she said, not to Lucy, almost to herself. He prepared for me. Before she stopped. Before I even understood what I was preparing for. Lucy crouched in front of her. Sarah, she said. James went into town. He's at Callahan's right now. Sarah was on her feet. Which direction did you come from, she said. North Road. She was already moving. She came through the door of Callahan's General Store, 17 minutes later, on foot, having walked the last quarter mile at a pace that was not quite running but contained everything running contains. Her hair had come partly loose, her boots were dusty. She did not stop to address any of that. She walked in and found Whitmore at the counter, his strange imported witness standing to one side. And James with his jaw set and his eyes flat in the way she had learned, meant he was controlling something considerable standing opposite them, and Mrs. Callahan behind the counter, watching the whole thing with the expression of a woman who had expected her store to be a general store, and not a theater, but was managing. There were 6 other people in the room. 2 of them she recognized as ranchers from the south of the county. One was the telegraph operator. One was a merchant whose name she didn't know. The other 2 were women, one of whom was the feed store owner, who had been among the first to turn away from the Caldwell account. Whitmore saw Sarah come in. He smiled. Well, he said. The woman herself. Sarah walked to James's side and stopped. She looked at the man standing next to Whitmore. He was about 45. Soft around the middle, with the specific quality of a person who had been told what to say and was rehearsing it while waiting for his cue. What is your name, she said. The man blinked. He had not expected to be addressed first. My name is. Before you answer, Seth said, still looking at him, I want everyone in this room to understand that whatever you say in the next 5 minutes is going to be repeated under oath in front of Judge Harlan Bates, who is currently sitting in Red Willow and who has an open formal inquiry into Charles Whitmore's business practices in this county. She looked around the room to make sure everyone had heard that. So I would encourage honesty. The man's mouth opened. Closed. His name is Porter, Whitmore said, his voice still smooth, still performing. Howard Porter. He worked in Cheyenne 3 years ago, and he personally witnessed. Did he work for the county land office? Sarah said. A pause. Yes or no, Sarah said. He worked in a clerical capacity. For Gerald Potts, Sarah said. The room went very quiet. Whitmore's expression shifted just slightly, just for a moment, and in that moment, Sarah saw the machinery behind the performance, and it was exactly as ugly as she had understood it to be. Gerald Potts, she said, turning to address the room directly, is the county land commissioner whose signature appears on a tax reassessment notice that raised James Caldwell's property tax by 80%, and whose stationery was used to send a threatening letter to James Caldwell's grain supplier in Billings, pressuring them to break a legitimate business contract. She paused. I have all of that in writing, notarized, witnessed by Judge Bates himself. And I have a signed statement from the man in Billings who received that letter, who kept the original, and who is sending it to Judge Bates by special courier as we stand here. The telegraph operator shifted on his feet. The wife of the feed store owner looked at her hands. Whitmore said, whatever documents this woman has produced. She produced them from your ledgers, James said. From receipts you didn't think anyone would ever cross-reference. From a letter your own hired man wrote a name on before he disappeared to Helena. He looked at Whitmore with the flat, steady expression of a man who had been patient for a very long time. How long did you think it would take, Charles? If the right person was paying attention. Whitmore looked at Howard Porter. Porter was staring at Sarah with the expression of a man recalculating the cost of something he had already agreed to do. Mr. Porter, Sarah said quietly. I don't know what Mr. Whitmore told you about me, or what he told you to say, or what he offered you for saying it. But I want you to understand something. She looked at him directly and without theater. Whatever lie you tell in this room today, I will find the truth of it. That is not a threat. It is a statement of fact based on my professional history, and I am very good at what I do. Howard Porter looked at Whitmore. He looked at the room. He looked at Sarah. He picked up his hat from the counter. I need some air, he said, and he walked out the door of Callahan's general store and did not come back. The silence that followed was of a particular density that Sarah had experienced only a handful of times in her life, the silence of a room full of people who had just watched a narrative collapse. Whitmore looked at the door. Then he looked at Sarah. This isn't over, he said. You came here to destroy my reputation in front of witnesses, Sarah said. You brought a man who was connected to a corrupt official in Billings, and you expected him to testify against me before I even knew what you were planning. You have been arranging things against James Caldwell for 3 years and against me for 3 weeks. She held his gaze without flinching. And you are still standing here, which tells me you are a man who is not accustomed to things not going his way. So I'll say this once. She took a breath. Judge Bates is in this town. Your evidence is walking out the door. Mine is notarized and corroborated, and en route from Billings. The inquiry is open. The record exists. She paused. This is over. Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at James. Then he walked out. His footsteps on the boardwalk outside were the only sound for what felt like a very long time. Then Mrs. Callahan, who had been standing behind her counter with an expression of absolute composure throughout the entire proceeding, reached under the counter and produced a cloth, which she used to wipe down the surface. Well, she said, that's the most interesting Thursday we've had in some while. One of the ranchers from the South County, a broad-shouldered man named Ferris, who had never, in Sarah's observation, spoken more than 4 words in sequence, said, Is it true? About Potts? Sarah looked at him. It is, she said, all of it. Ferris looked at James. My spring tax assessment went up 60%, he said. River-adjacent parcel. James looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Ferris. Write it down, she said. Everything you remember. Dates, amounts, anything you received in writing. Bring it to James by end of week. Ferris nodded slowly. The wife of the feed store owner had been standing very quietly throughout the latter part of the exchange. She was a woman named Agnes, middle-aged, with the particular manner of someone who made decisions carefully and did not revisit them easily. She came forward. "Miss Whitaker," she said. Sarah turned. "My husband was among the merchants who Agnes stopped. Started again. We closed our account with Mr. Caldwell 3 weeks ago." At Mr. Whitmore's suggestion, she met Sarah's eyes with some difficulty. "I would like to reopen it, if that is acceptable." Sarah looked at her. "That's James's decision," she said. "Not mine." Agnes turned to James. "It's acceptable," James said. No warmth, but no coldness either. Just the plain honesty of a man who did not hold grudges as a policy, but did not pretend injuries away either. Agnes nodded. She went back to her basket on the counter. They walked out of Callahan's into the afternoon sun. And Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in so long. She almost didn't recognize it, the particular lightness of a person who has been carrying something very heavy and has finally been allowed to set it down. Just for a moment. She was realistic enough to know that moments ended. James walked beside her and said nothing for half a block. Then he said, "You walked into town." "I did," she said. "In 17 minutes. Approximately." He looked at her sideways. "That's fast," he said. "I was motivated," she said. He said nothing, but she heard it anyway, the thing underneath the nothing, and she filed it in the category she had still not examined too closely, because she still had too much to do before she could afford to examine it. The Dawson letter arrived with Judge Bates 3 days later. Benjamin Dawson had done more than write a letter. He had sent the original Potts correspondence as promised, along with his own notarized statement, and he had also included, in a separate sealed envelope addressed directly to Judge Bates, a list of 3 other businesses in the region who had received similar communications from the county commissioner's office in the past 4 years. 3 other businesses. Sarah read that line twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. 3 others, James said. He was reading over her shoulder again. She had stopped noticing when that had become a habit they both had. "At least 3 that Dawson knew about," she said. "There may be more. That's not a campaign against me," James said quietly. "That's a pattern across the whole county." "Yes," she said. "That's what I was afraid of, and what I was hoping for." She looked at him. "Because a pattern changes the scale of the inquiry. It stops being a property dispute and becomes an abuse of public trust on a county-wide level." James sat down. "That's bigger than Bates," he said. "That's a state matter," she said. "Potentially federal, if the land involved crosses territorial survey boundaries." She looked at the letter. "Bates needs to see this today." They were at the boarding house within the hour. Bates read Dawson's letter and the accompanying documents with the same careful attention he brought to everything. He read the list of 3 businesses. He read the sealed note Dawson had included. His expression through all of it remained the precise, controlled non-expression of a man who did not let conclusions arrive on his face before they had finished forming in his mind. When he was done, he set everything flat on the table in front of him. "It's outside the scope of a county inquiry," he said. "I know," Sarah said. "I'm going to write to the State Land Board in Helena today," he said. "And I'm going to recommend that the county commissioner's office be placed under administrative review pending investigation." He looked at James. "In practical terms, that means Gerald Potts cannot initiate, authorize, or finalize any property actions in this county until the investigation concludes." James looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Bates. "How long until Helena responds?" she said. "A week to 10 days for the initial acknowledgement," Bates said. "The investigation itself could take several months." He paused. "But the administrative freeze is effective immediately upon my recommendation." "I'll send the telegraph today." Sarah absorbed that. Whitmore could not move on James's land, not legally. Not without going through a process that now had Sarah's documentation in the record. Not without an investigation that included Dawson's corroboration and Ellis's statement and the original Potts letter. Not without making everything visible that he had spent years keeping invisible. "Thank you, Judge," Sarah said. Bates looked at her with the particular expression she had come to associate with him, the expression of a man who had seen a great deal over a long career and had maintained his capacity to be quietly impressed by specific things. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "in 30 years on this circuit, I have reviewed a great deal of documentation assembled by a great many people." He paused. "Yours is among the most precisely organized I have seen. And I have seen work assembled by men with law degrees and years of practice." Another pause. "I am noting that in my official record of the inquiry." Sarah held his gaze. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and picked up his pen. The next morning, the telegraph from Bates to Helena went out. Sarah knew because the telegraph operator told her so, without being asked, when she came in for the supply run. He was a young man named Arthur, who had been in the room at Callahan's 3 days before, and who had, since that day, carried himself with the particular demeanor of someone who had decided to be honest, and was still getting used to the feeling. "It went out last night," he said. "Priority." "Thank you, Arthur," she said. He ducked his head, then looked up. "Miss Whitaker," he said. She waited. "I've been passing along." He stopped. "Messages. Between Whitmore's office and some people. Nothing I could put a name to. Just timing of things. When freight came in, when Judge Bates arrived in town, when your supply orders came through." He met her eyes with some difficulty. "I wasn't told what it was for, but I should have asked." Sarah looked at him. She thought about what it cost a young man in a small town to say that to anyone, loaned to the woman he had been inadvertently reporting on. "You're telling me now," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Then you're ahead of most people," she said. "Write it down. Same as I told the rancher. Everything you remember. Bring it to Judge Bates before he leaves town." Arthur nodded. She walked back to the wagon with her supplies and sat for a moment before picking up the reins. She thought about all the small pieces. The telegraph operator who had reported her supply orders. The merchants who had closed their accounts on Whitmore's word. The county commissioner who had used official stationery to threaten legitimate businesses. The hired man who had written a name on the back of a letter and then disappeared. The freight driver who had carried a message for double wages and carried the knowledge of it for 2 years. All the small pieces that had seemed individually like the ordinary texture of being a woman who was not wanted in a particular place. None of it had been ordinary. All of it had been deliberate. And all of it was now in the record. She picked up the reins and drove home. James was at the kitchen table when she came in. He had coffee ready, which had become its own language between them over the weeks. The coffee ready, meaning "I knew when you'd be back," meaning something that neither of them said directly, but both of them understood. She sat down and told him about Arthur. He listened. Then he said, "How many people has Whitmore been using, without them understanding what they were doing?" "Enough," she said. "Enough that when the state investigation goes through, there are going to be a lot of people in this county with things to account for." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "Some of them knew. Some of them didn't. Most of them are somewhere in between." "What happens to them?" James said. "The ones who cooperate with the investigation won't face the same consequences as the ones who don't," she said. "That's generally how these things work." She paused. "I've written to Robert Vale in Billings. He's going to come to Red Willow next week. I want someone with legal training to look at everything before the state investigators arrive." James looked at her. "You've been planning this since before the letter from Dawson arrived," he said. "I've been planning it since the night Potts came to the ranch," she said. "I just needed the evidence to catch up to the plan." He looked at her with the expression that had no clean name, the one she had been filing carefully and not examining. "You never stopped," he said. "Not once. Not when the merchants closed their accounts. Not when Whitmore came to this yard. Not when he brought a man to Callahan's to lie about you in front of the whole town." He shook his head slowly. "Most people would have. Yes." She looked at the coffee in her hands. "I've left enough places," she said quietly. "I left when I shouldn't have. I left my father's farm behind and told myself I couldn't do anything. I left Cheyenne quietly so as not to make trouble. I've left half a dozen situations because staying felt too dangerous and leaving felt like the only thing that wouldn't break me. She set the cup down. I am done leaving. James didn't say anything for a moment. Then good, just that good, in his voice which carried things in their plainness. She looked at him. He was watching her with the full attention of a man who was not performing, and had not been performing since the first moment she saw him, since he crossed a street in Red Willow and said 3 words, and changed the direction of everything. James, she said. I know, he said. We still have state investigation to get through. I know that too, and Vale coming next week and the administrative freeze to monitor, and... He said. She stopped. I know all of that, he said. I'm not asking you to set any of it aside, he held her gaze. I'm just asking you to let me, he paused, to let me be here. While all of it happens, not at a distance, here. The word here was very small and carried everything. She looked at him for a long moment. You've been here, she said. I want to be here on purpose, he said. She understood the difference. She sat with it for a moment, the difference between being present by circumstance and being present by choice, the vast and quiet distance between those two things, and what it meant for someone to close that distance and name it. She had spent years in a world where the distance was never closed, where she was tolerated, occasionally used, sometimes helped, but never chosen. Never specifically, deliberately, eyes open chosen. She looked at James Caldwell. He was not a complicated man in the ways that some people meant when they said that. He was not given to performance or to excess. He said what he meant in as few words as the meaning required, and then stopped talking. He crossed streets when they needed to be crossed and sat at kitchen tables until the work was done, and made coffee at the right moment, and held hands without making it into a declaration until the declaration was unavoidable. He was the kind of man who, Sarah was realizing, she had not previously understood existed outside of the stories her mother used to read to her when she was young enough to still believe in them. She was 32 years old, and she had stopped believing in them for a very long time. All right, she said. James looked at her. All right, he said. Here on purpose, she said. All right. Something in his face settled not into happiness exactly, but into the expression of a man who has been carrying something at arm's length for a long time and has finally been told he can put it down close. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. They sat like that for a while with the late afternoon light coming through the window and the sound of the river somewhere past the cottonwoods and the stack of legal documents on the far end of the table and all the remaining work between where they were and where they were going laid out before them, like a road they intended to take together. The next 7 days moved fast and hard. Robert Vale arrived on Wednesday, a compact, gray-haired man from Billings, with sharp eyes and a leather briefcase that had seen better decades and an expression of calm, professional interest that Sarah recognized as the face of a man who was good at his work and knew it without needing to announce it. He spent his first 3 hours at the kitchen table, reading every document Sarah had assembled. He read without comment. When he finished, he closed the folder, put his hands flat on the table, and looked at her. You have built a case, he said. A real one, with provable elements, documented sources, and a corroborating witness in another county. He paused. How much legal training do you have? None, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then you have exceptional instincts, he said. And very good organizational skills. I had a specific education, she said. The kind you get when someone does this to your family and nobody helps. Vale nodded slowly. I'm going to review this with the state investigator when he arrives, he said. I'd like to add 3 things to the record before that meeting: a formal statement from you about the sequence of events since your arrival in Red Willow, a compiled timeline with document references, and a letter requesting that Bill Marsh, James Quell's former hired man, be located and interviewed. I can have all 3 ready by tomorrow morning, Sarah said. Vale looked at her. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he said. I know, she said. He looked at James, who was leaning against the kitchen wall with his arms crossed, and the particular expression of a man watching someone else confirm what he already knew. "She's always like this." "Pretty much," James said. Vale opened his briefcase. "Then let's not waste the evening," he said. The state investigator arrived the following Monday. His name was Hugh Carver, and he was a tall, thin man from Helena with a formal manner and the kind of authority that didn't need announcing because it existed in the way he occupied a room. He had Bates's recommendation and the original Potts letter and the Dawson corroboration already on file, and he came to Red Willow with the specific intention of talking to 4 people: Judge Bates Robert, James Caldwell, and Sarah Whitaker. He talked to Sarah last. She sat across from him in Bates's temporary office and answered every question he asked with the same precise factual clarity she brought to everything. She did not editorialize. She did not attempt to characterize Whitmore beyond what the documents demonstrated. She presented herself as a person who had assembled accurate records from available evidence and had organized them for the official record, and she let the record speak. Carver listened to her for 90 minutes. He took notes. At the end, he set his pen down. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "the documentation you assembled is what makes this case actionable. The corroboration from Dawson, the Ellis statement, the ledger analysis taken individually, any one of them could be explained away. Together, and organized the way you've organized them, they form a clear pattern of deliberate misconduct." He paused. "You said you have no legal training." "That's correct," she said. "You should consider getting some," he said, formally. She looked at him. "I'll consider it," she said. He picked up his pen. The freeze on county property actions was confirmed in writing by the State Land Board the following Thursday. Gerald Potts was placed on administrative leave, pending investigation. The state inquiry into misconduct in the County Commissioner's office was formally opened. Whitmore was in his office when the official notice arrived. The man who brought it said later that Whitmore read it 3 times and then sat very still for a long time. He did not come to the Caldwell Ranch again. He did not come to Callahan's and hold court. He sent no more men to speak against Sarah in the street. The silence from his direction was, in its own way, its own kind of answer. It was on a Friday evening, 12 days after the state inquiry opened, that Agnes came to the ranch. Sarah was in the yard when the wagon came up the road. Agnes was alone, which was unusual. She had a basket covered with a cloth and an expression of someone who had made a decision and was committed to it before the wagon stopped. She got down without waiting for help. She came to Sarah and held out the basket. "From my kitchen," she said. "Bread and a roasted chicken and some preserves." She paused. "My husband and I were among the first to close our account when Whitmore said to. We did it without asking why." She looked at Sarah with the directness of a woman who had stopped pretending. "I'm sorry for that." Sarah took the basket. She had been carrying a version of this moment, the anticipation of it, the complicated feelings about it for weeks. She had thought she would feel something hard when it came. Some residue of the anger that had sustained her through the worst of it. What she actually felt was tired in the way that comes after a long fight, when the muscles finally release. "Thank you, Agnes," she said. "I should have asked questions," Agnes said. "Before I listened to him." "You should have." She held the basket. "But you're asking them now. That's something." Agnes nodded. She looked like a woman who had expected more difficulty and wasn't sure what to do with the lack of it. "Your husband's account is welcome at the ranch," Sarah said. "If he wants it back." "He does," she said. She drove back down the road, and Sarah stood in the yard with the basket and looked out at the riverland at James Caldwell's land, which was no longer under threat, which now had the weight of an official state investigation between it and the man who had wanted it. She looked at the house, at the cottonwoods, at the ordinary, specific, unremarkable beauty of a place that had become, without her planning it and without her quite being able to say when, the first place in a very long time that felt like it might be hers. Not just a situation she had walked into, not just a problem she had solved. Hers. She carried the basket inside. James was at the stove, and he turned when he heard the door, and he looked at the basket and then at her face and said, "Agnes." "Agnes," she said. He turned back to the stove. "Stay for supper then," he said. "I already live here," she said. "I know," he said. "I meant Agnes. She's gone." Sarah paused. "Good," James said. "Then it's just us, just us." She set the basket on the table and unpacked it. She put the bread on the board and the chicken aside for tomorrow and set 2 of the preserves jars on the shelf. And she did all of it in the kitchen of the Caldwell Ranch that had started feeling like her kitchen sometime in the second week when she'd reorganized the shelves, and James had never put anything back in the wrong place. Just us. She did not examine the feeling too closely. She let it be there, whole and quiet and real, and she did not try to put a name on it that was bigger than the moment. Because she had learned at great cost and over many years that the most important things did not need to be declared out loud to be true. Some things were simply true. This was one of them. The verdict came on a Thursday. Sarah was in the kitchen when James rode back from town, and she knew before he opened the door, knew from the sound of his horse coming in too fast, knew from the way his boots hit the porch steps with more force than usual, knew the way she had learned to know most things about this man over the course of a year that had changed the shape of her life entirely. He came through the door and looked at her. "Guilty," he said. "All 4 counts." She set down the bowl she was holding. She stood in the middle of the kitchen she had reorganized 10 months ago and felt the word land in her chest, not like a blow, but like a key turning in a lock she had been carrying for a very long time. "Potts," she said. "Accepted the reduced sentence this morning," James said. Vale was there. He sent word with Billy. He came to the table and set his hat down. "It's done, Sarah." She had heard him say those words before. In October, standing in the yard with the Helena letter. Again in the spring with the survey results. Each time she had gently corrected him, "Not yet. Not fully. Still more to get through." She did not correct him now. "It's done," she said. He looked at her across the table, the same table where she had first spread his ledgers, and found the double payments where she had written letters to Billings by lamplight, where they had sat across from each other and built something out of documents and honesty, and the particular courage of 2 people who had each decided, for different reasons, and at different costs, that they were done being afraid. He crossed to her. He took her face in his hands the way he had the morning. The Helena letter arrived gentle and certain, and without any performance attached to it. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she said. "Sarah." "James, I am not going to argue about this on the day the man was convicted, so don't start." Something crossed his face that was entirely a smile, the real one, the one that she had been watching appear more frequently over the past months, and that still had the quality of something emerging from a long winter, cautious and genuine at once. "All right," he said. He kissed her. She let him. Outside, the October light was the color of the good kind of ending, not the false bright of things that are over too soon, but the deep, earned gold of a season that has run its full course and is settling into what comes next with the patience of something that knows its own worth. The news reached Red Willow before supper. Sarah knew because Lucy Hart arrived at the ranch at 4 o'clock with Tom behind her and her youngest on her hip and an expression of pure, unguarded joy that she did not appear to be making any effort to contain. "We heard," Lucy said, coming through the door without knocking, which had become an established habit that Sarah had decided she liked. Arthur ran the notice down to the store the moment it came through the wire. Tom Hart shook James's hand with both of his, the particular handshake of men who do not typically express themselves through touch but have found an occasion that justifies it. 14 months, Tom said. "From the day you first walked into Bates's office." 15, Sarah said. "If you count from the day I arrived." "I count from the day you arrived," Lucy said firmly. She set her youngest down and looked at with the full weight of everything they had been through in that 15 months, the supply orders Lucy had filled, when merchants wouldn't. The morning she had ridden fast up the road to warn about Whitmore at Callahan's, the careful, unglamorous solidarity of a woman who had simply refused to look away. "How does it feel?" Sarah thought about that honestly. "Strange," she said. I've been working toward this for so long that now it's here I keep expecting another problem to solve. Lucy laughed. There will be other problems, she said. Different ones. Smaller ones, good, Sarah said. I know how to handle those. They stayed for supper, Tom and Lucy and the child. And Billy the ranch hand, who had been with the Caldwell, spread through all of it, and who ate his food with the quiet satisfaction of a young man who had been on the right side of something and knew it. The table was loud in the way that tables are loud when people have survived something together and are still frightened to by sitting at the same table on the other side of it. After supper, when the hearts had gone, and Billy had taken himself to the bunkhouse and the fire had settled into its evening quiet, James and Sarah sat in the kitchen the way they had learned to sit in it, not filling the silence because it needed filling, but living inside it because it was theirs. Robert Vale wrote, James said. Sarah looked up. He's recommending you formally, James said. To a law office in Billings, he says, and I have the letter here. He produced it from his coat pocket. He says, and I'm reading directly, Miss Whitaker possesses a natural aptitude for legal reasoning and documentary analysis that formal training would make formidable. It would be a waste of a significant talent to leave it unrecognized. He set the letter on the table between them. He's asking if you'd consider studying with his firm. Part-time to start. He says he'll arrange the reading materials himself. Sarah looked at the letter. She looked at it for a long time. She had thought about this, the thing Carver had said during the investigation, and Vale's comments since. And the growing awareness that the work she had done over these 15 months was not just the organizational competence, but something with a name and a professional shape and a future that she had not previously thought to map. Billings is 4 hours by horse, she said. 3.5 if the road's dry, James said. And Vale said he can arrange most of the reading by post. He held her gaze. This isn't me telling you what to do. I want to be clear about that. I know, she said. But I want you to know that if you wanted to go to Billings, he said, or if you wanted to pursue this in whatever form made sense, the ranch would still be here. I would still be here. She looked at him. I know that too, she said. She picked up the letter. She read it through herself. Vale's handwriting was precise and slightly impatient, the handwriting of a man whose thinking moved faster than his pen, and in that precision she heard the exact quality of what he was offering, not charity, not patronage, but the professional acknowledgement of one person who knew something to another person who had demonstrated that she knew it too. She set it down. I'd like to write to him, she said. Tonight if you have paper. James got up and got her paper. She wrote the letter at the kitchen table while he sat across from her and read, and she was aware as she wrote of the specific quality of that moment. Of a man reading quietly while a woman wrote her own professional future into existence at his kitchen table, which had become her kitchen table, in his house, which had become her house. In a life that had been built from nothing she had planned and everything she had needed. She sealed the letter. She set it beside the account ledger that was already prepared for tomorrow's work, and she looked at the two things, sitting side by side, the ledger that had started everything, the letter that might be starting something else, and she felt the truth of her own life as a continuous thing for the first time in years. Not a series of survivals, not a succession of doors closing. A life that was moving forward with her in it, of her own making, on her own terms. James, she said. He looked up. Thank you, she said. For the letter, for telling me. It's your letter, he said. I just carried it in. She shook her head slowly. Not just for the letter, she said. For all of it. For crossing the street. For offering work instead of pity. For sitting at this table at 10 o'clock at night with a box full of old papers and deciding the truth worth the trouble of finding it. She met his eyes directly, the way she had learned to look at him without calculation, without the careful measuring of how much was safe to show. I came to Red Willow with nothing, and you saw something worth seeing before I had shown you anything at all. James looked at her steadily. You had your list, he said. She laughed, sudden and real. I had my list, she agreed. He smiled. I knew from the list, he said. Anyone who shows up with a list that precise, written that carefully, handed over that directly, that's a person who knows their own worth even when the world hasn't caught up to them yet. He paused. I just didn't let the world stay behind. She held his gaze and felt the full weight of that sentence, of being known before being proven, of being seen before being explained, of someone looking at a woman standing in the dirt with a suitcase and a list and understanding, without being shown that she was worth the ground she was standing on. She reached across the table. He took her hand. Outside, Red Willow went on, doing what small towns do in October, drawing in, settling down, preparing for winter with the practical industry of people who have learned that preparation is its own form of hope. The days were getting shorter. The river road would be harder in a month. The work would compress and the evenings would lengthen, and the ranch would once again fill up with the particular intimacy of winter, which Sarah had stopped dreading and begun, quietly and without announcement, to look forward to. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning when the first real snow was making up its mind in the clouds overhead, Marta arrived at the ranch with 2 other women Sarah recognized from the south end of town. They came with a purpose. There was a woman in their community, they said, a widow named Clara, who had received a notice from a land agent, claiming she owed back taxes on a parcel she had owned outright for 11 years. The notice didn't look right. The figures didn't match anything Clara had on record. And one of the women had thought, given everything that had happened, given what Sarah had managed to do with documents and letters, and the careful assembly of facts, that maybe Sarah would be willing to look at it. Sarah looked at the notice. She looked at it for about 45 seconds. This is fraudulent, she said. The assessment authority referenced here was invalidated in the state review in March. Whoever sent this is either ignorant of current land law or hoping Clara isn't. Marta looked at the other 2 women. What do we do? She said. You write a response, Sarah said, tonight, citing the specific March ruling by number, which I have in my files. You send it by registered post to the address on the notice, and you send a copy to Robert Vale in Billings with a note asking him to flag it for follow-up. She looked at the 3 of them. And you tell Clara she owes nothing, and she is not going to lose her land. The relief that moved through that room was the specific relief of people who have been frightened about something and have just been told by someone who knows what they're talking about that the fear was manufactured. Marta looked at Sarah with the expression she had been wearing since October, the expression of a woman who had stood in the street with a basket and done nothing and had been finding ways to make up for it ever since. We don't know how to thank you, she said. Learn how to read an assessment notice, Sarah said. Then teach someone else. She folded the fraudulent notice and handed it back. That's how you thank me. After they left, James came in from outside where he had been doing the morning chores and found Sarah already at the table, writing the response letter she had promised. He looked at the table, at the letter taking shape under her hand, at her face, which was doing the focused, efficient thing it did when she was working, present and certain, and completely at home in what she was doing. He poured 2 cups of coffee, set one beside her without interrupting. Sat down across from her. She finished the paragraph she was on. Looked up. Clara Hinton, she said, widowed. South County. Fraudulent assessment notice. I heard some of it, he said. I told them I'd help, she said. I know, he said. She picked up the coffee. Is that all right? She said. Not asking permission, she had not asked James's permission for anything since the 2nd week she was here, and he had not expected her to. Just checking the temperature of the room the way a person does when they are making a decision that will affect more than themselves. He looked at her with the plain, steady expression of a man who had watched a woman he loved spend 50 years solving problems that were not strictly her responsibility to solve, and had never once been tempted to ask her to stop. That's more than all right, he said. She nodded once. Went back to the letter. The snow made up its mind by noon and came down in the way Montana snow came down, committed, comprehensive, without apology. The ranch went quiet under it. The river muffled. The road disappeared. The world contracted to the warm and particular dimensions of a house that had been a silent place and was no longer. A house that had been filled with the specific loneliness of one person going through the motions of a life, and was now filled instead with the sounds of two people building one. Sarah finished the letter for Clara Hinton and started on the winter supply order, and then moved to the Caldwell ledger, which was the most organized it had been in the ranch's history, and which she updated with the particular satisfaction of someone doing work that mattered in a place that was theirs. James repaired tack at the other end of the table, and the fire burned and the snow accumulated, and neither of them needed to fill the quiet because the quiet was not empty anymore. It had not been empty for a long time. At some point in the afternoon, Sarah looked up and found James watching her with the expression that had no clean name, the one that had been building since October of the previous year and had never quite resolved itself into something smaller, because what it was not a small thing. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, "just thinking." "About what?" He looked at her for a moment. "About the fact that I almost didn't cross the street," he said. She stilled. "What do you mean?" she said. "I was watching from the store window," he said. "When Whitmore came down off the boardwalk. I'd seen him do it before, go after people, make them small in public. I'd always told myself it wasn't my business." He paused. "I almost told myself that again. What changed?" she said. He looked at her. "You didn't move," he said. "When he came at you like that, you just stood there. Straight. Not defiant, not afraid, just there. Like a person who had decided a long time ago that they were not going to bend to things like this, even when bending was safer." He shook his head slightly. "I'd never seen anyone stand like that, and I thought somebody should say something. Somebody should—" He stopped. "And then I thought, why is it always somebody else?" Sarah held that for a moment. She thought about all the times in her life she had stood exactly like that straight and absorbing, and had looked at the faces around her and found nobody willing to be the somebody else. She thought about what it had cost her, compounded over years. What it had taken from her. How much she had paid in silence and departures for the consistent failure of every room she had ever been in to produce one person willing to say, "Enough." One person. That was all it took. One person willing to cross a street. "I'm glad you did," she said. Her voice was even. Her eyes were clear. She was not going to cry about this. She had already done the crying about this, alone in the early weeks when she was still learning what it meant to have been seen. "I'm glad it was you." James nodded. He did not dress it up. "So am I," he said. The snow kept falling on Red Willow, Montana. On the Caldwell Ranch and the river that ran behind it, and the road that connected them to a town that had learned, at some cost to its own comfort, what it meant to pay attention to, who was standing in its streets, and what was being done to them. On a woman who had come to that town with 2 cheeks and a list and a heart that had been made careful by loss, and who had put down the suitcase and stayed. On a man who had crossed a street when he almost hadn't, and who had spent every day since being grateful that he did. The world had called Sarah Whitaker unwanted. It had sent her from town to town, with nothing to recommend her but her own considerable competence and the stubborn, undimming knowledge that she was worth more than what anyone had given her. She had not needed the world to agree with her in order for it to be true. She had needed one person to see it out loud, and one person had. And that was the whole of it, the beginning and the middle and the end of a story that proved what people rarely want to believe, because it is so simple it seems insufficient, that a single moment of decency, offered freely, without guarantee of return, can redirect an entire life. James Caldwell crossed a street. Sarah Whitaker stayed. Everything else was built from that.